study course in epistemological metaphors will provide you with the opportunity to make sense and to use the kinds of metaphors that your clients present to you in the course of therapy. It's important to remember that these methods should be adjunctive to normal therapeutic practice, and that you look for ways of integrating these techniques into your therapeutic modality. I think a useful way of thinking about metaphors is that they help you to go in and reach and touch the past. Healing the experiences of the past will help you to undermine the etiology of a client's presenting symptoms. And in doing so, it makes it easier for working with therapeutic modalities that are locused in the here and the now. We begin with tape 1, learning some of the theoretical framework that will help you to make sense and to decipher some of the encoded messages and information that is found in the world of metaphors. Tapes 2, 3, and 4 will involve case studies of physical abuse, sexual abuse, and incest. These case studies will help you learn how to ask the questions so that you can feel as though you're participating in the interview itself. A metaphor is a container of information. One of the original Greek words for it comes from the word amphora, and an amphora was a container. So a metaphor is where the meaning of something is carried across into something else. So many of our experiences are not stored in terms of actual memory. They may be stored somatically in the body, and that we don't have any semantic or visual recall of the experience. So in developing metaphors, we find that they often will contain memory information, particularly when the metaphors are somatized, say below the neck down. So a metaphor is a container of information, and we have to learn the special language that's required to get information from out of this particular metaphor. The second thing about a metaphor is that it is a foreign object. And it's a foreign object which has somehow been imported into the body of your client. Now, if you think about the kinds of metaphors that a client will bring in therapy, they may say, I've got a blank in my head, or I'm blocking. I've got butterflies in my stomach, or I'm all tied up in knots, or my heart is pounding like a drum, or I've got a big lump in my throat, or I feel as though a hand is tightening around my neck. Now, what you'll notice about these metaphors are that they belong outside of the body. And it's this foreignness of these metaphors that exacerbates the particular feelings that pertain to traumatic memories or to traumatic events. And what would you like to have happen?
I would like to stop feeling guilty about hating my parents.
And when you feel guilty, where do you feel guilty when you feel guilty?
In my head, and in my heart, and in my stomach.
And in your head, and in your heart, and in your stomach. And when you feel guilty in your head and your heart and your stomach, where do you feel guilty the most?
In my heart.
And when you feel guilty in your heart, whereabouts in your heart do you feel guilty?
All over.
And when you feel guilty all over. And it's in your heart. Whereabouts in your heart?
It's on the outside. It's like a fire burning.
And it's like a fire burning. And what kind of fire could that fire be when it's like a fire burning?
One that's out of control.
And is there anything else about a fire that's burning and it's out of control?
It's as if my whole chest is on fire as a result of it.
So one of the important aspects in healing with metaphors is that these objects have somehow to be placed outside of the body in the context of memory or ground. So in the Gestalt sense, you have the figure and you have the ground which exists outside of the body. So part of our healing function with metaphors is to give them the opportunity to be placed outside.
Open and relaxed.
And hands open and relaxed. And when hands are open and relaxed, and would a curved sewing needle be interested in going to hands that are open and relaxed?
Yes.
And what could hands that are open and relaxed do with a needle that was curved?
Hands could straighten the needle.
And hands could straighten the needle, and could those hands straighten a needle?
Yes.
And as those hands straighten a needle, what would those hands like to do with a needle?
Create.
And create. And what would those hands like to create?
Beauty.
And beauty. And what would be the first beauty that they'd like to create?
A tapestry.
Metaphors come as a result of the interaction between questions that are asked by the therapist and responses from the client. Metaphors are born at very specific moments in time. And we find that metaphors are representations or symbolic forms of actual symptoms or feelings. So for instance, a client may give you a feeling word or a thought word, and metaphors are derived from those particular words. So I'm feeling angry, I'm feeling upset, or I have a pain in my shoulder. So we take that semantic word and we want to ask questions which will give rise to a metaphor. And a metaphor ought to be an object that you can draw. So here are the questions that we ask to develop a metaphor. We first ask the question, and what would you like to have happen? And we want to get the information in the client's words. Then we ask the question, and when you have, how do you know you have? And this establishes the epistemology, how the client knows they know what they've got. And what's important then is to establish where. Where do you have that particular feeling, and whereabouts? So we ask the where question about 3 times. The next stage is to ask, and does it have a shape or a size? And you'll notice here the use of the personal pronoun it. And the use of it helps to differentiate the ownership of the particular metaphor and establish it as a separate entity from the I-ness of the client? And is it on the inside or the outside? That again helps to establish location. And what's it like? That is the simile. And what kind? And is there anything else about? So these are the questions that we use to establish and to give birth to a metaphor from a feeling word or a thought word. And what would you like to have happen?
I would like for the pain to go away.
And when you have the pain, where do you have the pain?
I have the pain in my ankle and in my foot, on the inner side of my foot.
And on the inner side of your foot. And when it's on the inner side of your foot, what's it like when it's on the inner side of your foot?
It's like pressure.
And pressure. And when it's like pressure, what kind of pressure?
It's like a balloon. It's like a balloon that's filled to capacity.
And a balloon that's filled to capacity. And is there anything else about a balloon that's filled to capacity?
It feels like it's going to burst.
Now these metaphors are epistemological metaphors. And the difference is this. Epistemology means how do you know something? What's the basis of your knowledge? So how do you know you have that particular feeling? It's important to distinguish between these kinds of metaphors which come from the client. They belong to the client. They belong to the client's history. And metaphors that are, say, Ericksonian. Ericksonian metaphors are provided by the therapist. And the therapist tries to match metaphors which are more teaching tales or allegories or parables to the client's experience. So those are supported by the therapist. In terms of Jungian metaphors or Jungian symbols, these come from the social milieu. Jungian symbols have a sense of a global imagery. They belong to a particular culture. And so we have archetypes that in some sense may mirror the individual's own experience. Now, epistemological metaphors are not cultural and they don't come from the therapist, but epistemological metaphors come from inside the client's actual experience. So what becomes important is that we ask questions that do not contaminate the client's experience. And what would you like to have happen?
I'd like to feel like I had better control of my life.
And when you don't have better control of your life, how do you know you don't have better control of your life?
I have severe migraines, ulcers, seizures.
And when you have those, whereabouts do you have them when you have them?
I feel it doors to my head.
And in your head. And whereabouts in your head do you have them when you have them?
All over, but primarily at the base of my skull.
And at the base of your skull. And when you have them, and they're at the base of your skull, do they have a shape or a size when they're at the base of your skull?
Like an explosion.
And like an explosion. When you work with metaphors, you're required to use a different way of asking questions. that may seem quite foreign from the normal therapeutic questioning process. So we're going to examine some of the properties of what are called clean language. And clean language is the art of asking questions so that you as a therapist do not contaminate or impose a model of the world upon your client. So for instance, asking a client how they feel or what they think is a product of your particular orientation at the time you ask the question. And so if you ask a client, what are they thinking right now, they may in fact be feeling something. So when we ask questions, we don't want to impose upon the client what we are thinking or feeling at that moment. In other words, questions that would devalue the client's experience. So we're going to examine some of the properties that make clean language a different way of asking questions than our normal or more conventional therapeutic training would have us do. And the first one is perhaps the pronoun, I. Now, you as a therapist do not want to use the pronoun I, such as I want you to do such and such, because that makes the client be in the here and now. And in asking questions, we want to leave them regressed into the past where their information comes from. So to begin, we're going to ask questions that go to the information center of the client. Now, if the client says the pronoun I, and we respond with the pronoun you, what we can generally know is that the pronoun you is going to go to the adult part of the client. And we need to separate out where the I-ness of the adult is and where their information is. That is, their information center. And this is where we find metaphors. So to begin with, we find out, for example, if there's a knot in the stomach. We want to know and get access to that knot rather than to the whole you-ness or I-ness of the client. So that's our purpose in being very careful and parsimonious with how we ask questions that involve the pronoun you or I. We want to access the metaphor and establish the transference or countertransference between the therapist and the knot in the stomach, which is the metaphor, not to the ego center of your adult client. Now, some other features which will facilitate this is in the way we use language and ask questions. So the questions are asked very slowly. And what would you like to have happen? And when they're asked in this manner, the speed is usually about 1/3 your normal speaking rate. Because very often these metaphors belong to an earlier or younger part of the adult. And so if it's a childhood experience, the questions need to be said very softly and very slowly. This helps to regress the client back into the past and helps us to establish where the metaphor is. Other features of clean language involve asking questions which are not directive, questions in the subjunctive mood. The subjunctive mood asks for cases of possibility, and you might like to begin to think about whether or not. So you invite the client. Why this is important is that many times in working with metaphors, we're going to have to work content-free, particularly if there's an amnesic quality to the experience. So the client doesn't exactly know what they're talking about. And we have to ask questions that goes to the metaphor so that it can gently unravel the information that's hidden or enfolded inside the metaphor. So our questions must be slow and soft, and we must allow the client the opportunity not to answer our questions. And this is why the subjunctive mood is so important. I want the client to be able to say no or yes with equal valence or probability. You see, when you get resistance from a client, it's very often a metaphor's way of saying to you as the therapist, don't ask that question, it's irrelevant. So any kind of resistance is a clue about the last question I just asked. So one of the important elements in using clean language is that I must only ask questions that are answerable, not necessarily by the adult client, but answerable by this metaphor. And one of the intriguing things is when you start talking to the metaphor and personifying it as if you were establishing the transference and countertransference between you and the metaphor, then we can find out to whom does this particular feeling belong to? To whom does this symptom belong to? And so very often inside a metaphor, when we go inside there, we may find a child within. That is, this particular feeling is not owned by this adult. It does not belong to them. It belongs to an earlier part of themselves. And in valuing this not, we then find out that it is owned by this child within. And so that's part of the healing process of working with metaphors, is that we need to establish ownership. To whom does that feeling belong to? Now, if it belongs to a 6-year-old, then what we need to do is our intervention, using these metaphors, has to be one which can be heard, felt, and which makes sense to a 6-year-old, not to a 36-year-old adult client in your office. So some of the properties that clean language gives us is we want to bypass the rational linear logic of the adult. Our questions need to go speedily and rapidly towards the center of the information. Hence, we want to be information-centered rather than client-centered in a Rogerian sense. Now, when we go to the center of information, we may find that there is an owner of this feeling. And this is how we can get a child within, or we can establish the age of the metaphor. Now, metaphors are usually very primitive, and we have to grow and mature these primitive metaphors up. But to do that, our communication needs to be established between the therapist and between a 6-year-old's feeling in the stomach. So one of the maxims that we may use is this: when you're wounded as a child, you need to be healed as a child. So if this feeling derives from a 6-year-old, then we need words to access a 6-year-old's language. If it's a 3-year-old, then we need to talk perhaps a lot more slower and more clearly and more gently to a 3-year-old. So this is the purpose of speaking clean language. When you're working with metaphors, it ought to sound weird and feel perhaps uncomfortable, because it's not a normal way of talking. It's cold, and it's cold, and cold like what? and it's dark and musty and black and trapped, and it's cold and damp. And when it's cold and damp, what kind of cold and damp could that cold and damp be? Oh, well. And it's cold and damp like a well. Metaphors provide a way in which a client can characterize their experience without having to put it into linear rational logic. Metaphors are deeply agreeable to unconscious processes. That allows a client to use language that couches and protects the experience. So trauma can be pouched in language that will not re-traumatize the client all over again. So one of the benefits of using metaphors is that it provides a mechanism that will lessen the probability that you as a therapist will re-traumatize the client, creating iatrogenic influences in which your attempts at curing or helping or healing are in fact worse than the original presenting psychopathology. Another feature to working with metaphors is that they also create a dissociation or an analgesic around the experience. There's something protective about the metaphors, that they will not sear and burn the psyche of the client. Clients who cannot and do not remember have either repressed or suppressed memories that have amnesia qualities to them. It doesn't matter. The metaphors contain the experience. Very often you'll have a client who has no visual recall of the memory, but all they have is the feeling tone or quality to it. So there's a somatic memory. The beauty of working with metaphors is that you can be content-free, but you just deal with whatever quality the client gives you. There's also no invasion of privacy. You can help dignify the client's experience so that they don't have to expose the details of their experience. If a client is unable to speak of the trauma, for instance, they feel like they're going to throw up, or they get lumps in their throat that get bigger, then they don't have to provide the content at all. As you'll notice through some of the demonstrations, often the client does not give us the historical information, perhaps just a brief discourse, but none of the detail. And how much easier it is for a person to talk about their experience retrospectively after it's all over than have to talk about it when they haven't gone through it yet. So metaphors provide a way in which we can lessen the probability that we'll re-traumatize the client. And it gives us a facilitatory language that can reach right into the client and bypass the rational linear adult to get information which comes out of their past. Information which is primary process language. That's different from secondary processing language, the language that I'm using now. But metaphors give very primary process access. So we can take a semantic word and we can convert that into a somatic form. We can take a word such as anger and translate that into a metaphor such as a volcano that's wanting to explode in the chest. So we take the semantic and we somatize it into a metaphor. Now let's examine, where are metaphors found in time? We know that they're found in place, in terms of there's a specific location within the body of the client. But where are they found in time? Metaphors are found in very specific moments of time. And the symptoms from which these metaphors are derived are found regressed back in the past. So as well as managing place, we need to manage the element of time. So we have the space-time continuum as well. Now let's just examine for a moment where a metaphor is found in time. So to begin, if we take the example of a particular memory experience, then what we know is that nobody is going to remember the whole of this experience in its entirety. And so a person generally remembers very specific moments of that experience and an abundance of detail, but may delete the rest of it. So we're going to take this moment of time here, and this moment of time we'll call T. That is, the moment in time T is the traumatic moment, the moment which was the worst in the whole of that memory experience. Now we find that metaphors are in the moment of time before T, that is T minus 1. And the T moment could be a split second, or it could be several minutes. And T minus 1 can have that same period of time as well. Now, after the worst moment is the moment of time we'll call T plus 1. So we find metaphors are going to be locused in this area in time. So they occupy a specific geographical location in the body of the client, and they're also born at very specific moments. And so one of the abilities that a client has is they're able to regress back from this moment in time T somewhere back before the worst moment. And so symptoms are then recapitulated that belong in this moment of time. So one of the purposes of the replay of these symptoms is that they prevent this particular event here from reoccurring. So you'll notice, for instance, in sexual abuse cases, that a lot of the symptoms are not located genitally, but they're very often located in the stomach or in the chest. And so these symptoms are the result of the reactions that occur before the actual perpetration itself occurs, even if it's a split second. So waking up in a cold sweat, in a nightmare, just before he grabs you, that's all T minus 1 moment of time. So symptoms will then keep replaying themselves over and over again. And it's from these symptoms that we get the metaphors. Now, one of our tasks then is we need to mature the information. And by maturing information, we find that a client will have regressed back to, say, this moment of time. And in order to find out what is the significance of this metaphor, we need to grow the client up so that we can get towards T and find out what T is. So generally, when you get metaphors to begin with, they're usually fragmented and disparate pieces of information. And there's no way you can generally know what to do with it until it's been matured. And an example is of a woman client who presents with insomnia, and she says, I can't turn the light switch off in my head. Now that's an unusual phrasing. So here we have the light switch, and so what we know to begin with, any symptom you get is going to be immature, and it has to be growing up. Now, if she had have presented and said, well, I can't get into REM sleep after 40 minutes, then I would not work with metaphors. I'd be more inclined to work very cognitively with her, because that's probably an adult problem. Whereas the question is, that's an unusual phrasing. I know I have insomnia because I can't turn the light switch off in my head. And so our next task is to grow that up and to ask this question: to whom does that light switch belong? And so as I grow that up, then I find out what T is. And the memory is when she was 6 years old and she was asleep in bed and someone came and sat on the bed and she does not know what they did to them. Now, as I grow this up, this is what T is. And what's happened is this child has regressed back in time to the light switch. And what she's done is she has fused herself to the light switch. So there is no separateness or ego boundary between who she is and between the external environment. And one of the things a child does is when they regress back in time, they regress back to a moment when she can control the environment. So what we can probably guess is that the light is still on when this light switch is on. And if this happened in the middle of the night, she's been able to regress probably about 2 or 3 hours. Now, if she could only regress to here, where it was only 1 hour, then you see her environment would be dark. And a child cannot control the dark. So by regressing back to 2 or 3 hours when a light switch is on, then a child can control the light switch. So that's what a child does to freeze a moment of time or experience. And as long as a light switch is on, it doesn't get dark, he never comes in and does it. And in order to heal this situation, we have to find out who that light switch is and then grow that light switch up, because it doesn't belong to the adult woman who has insomnia. It's the child's light switch. So to heal this situation, it must be healed in a way that makes sense to a child. And to begin with, metaphors are going to be merely fragments of an experience. To make sense of them, we have to grow them up and towards T. And the implications of this are thus. Things are always going to go from bad to worse before they get better. So as we grow the symptoms towards T, we discover that things go from bad to worse.
Feels like my world closes in.
And it feels like your world closes in. And when it feels like your world closes in, it closes in like what?
Narrowing, suffocating.
And narrowing and suffocating. And as your world closes in, and it's narrowing and suffocating, and what does it close in like when it's narrowing and suffocating?
Strangulation.
Like strangulation. So here are the questions we ask to mature the metaphors once we find them in T-1, and as we grow them towards T, they then go from bad to worse. Now the first question you always ask to the metaphor, which means you don't include the pronoun you or he or she. So if the metaphor was a not, and what would not like to have happen, and what would not like to do? And that's a question that goes directly to the metaphor. Now we can grow out information by asking, and as that happens, what happens next? And we can grow out time by asking, and how long will that take? And what happens after that happens? So what's important to understand is that these questions give a sense of horizontal movement and moves the information towards T. And so, what happens next? after liquid has been sloshing.
Sloshing liquid really doesn't want to hurt me, but it is making me sick. I think it's making me sick. I think that's what it is. It's just sort of going round and round,
and as it's going around and round, it's going around and round like what?
I was going to say a top. It's sort of spinning.
And it's spinning. And as it's going around and round and spinning, what happens next as it's going around and spinning?
Well, it just keeps spinning, and it's sort of splashing,
and it's spinning and it's splashing. And as it's spinning and it's splashing, then what happens?
I want it to stop.
And you want it to stop. And what does liquid want to do?
Liquid wants to be warm.
And liquid wants to be warm. When working with metaphors, it must be remembered that they do not occur in isolation. And so we're going to consider the other information storage forms that occur with metaphors as well. So to begin, there's always the adult's information. And that's what we get right at the very beginning of our experience. So when the adult says, well, what I want to be is free, or I don't want to have this feeling. Now our purpose in accessing metaphors is we need to take that adult's information and we need to place that into T-1. And in T-1, we find there are 3 different kinds of information. The first, which we have considered, which is metaphors, and these metaphors are contained inside the body. And we ask these questions to move the metaphors information towards T. But there's also other information. There's the information about the body itself. So in this particular case, the body, for instance, belonging to a child within, is what's important. Now, the clue to when you have a body is the use of the pronouns I, or he, or she. So when we hear these pronouns, it's a clue that there's a body involved in the experience. When we know it's a metaphor, is an I pronoun followed by a feeling or a thought word gives us the clue to a metaphor. And our third component of information that's stored in T-1 is, in actual fact, memory or ground. And this is when we have information which belongs outside of the body. It's not the body, it's not the feelings inside, but it's external. So it's the difference between the figure, which is the body, and the ground, which is the external environment. And so that would be characterized by a pronoun such as it, or it's cold, or he's coming to get me. We know that that's external to the body. So when we ask questions to mature the information through T-1, we now have a choice to value whatever information form the client gives us. So if there is a feeling word, then we know to ask, and when you have, where do you have? That puts the question inside the body. If we get an I pronoun followed by reference to a body part, such as, I want to run away, I can't move, then we can use the personal pronoun you, and you can't move. Now, if the client gives you only a body part, such as my feet can't move, my eyes can't see, or my hands are stuck, then it's important not to use the personal pronoun. Because what the child is trying to tell you to begin with is they only exist as their feet, nothing else. Now if you say, and your feet, then you connect the your pronoun to the rest of, to the feet, when the your goes to the body and the body's not there. So you split the body into the parts when you're given parts, because what the child is trying to say is, at this moment, all I am is just parts. There's no there to the rest of my body. And so feet are stuck. And when feet are stuck, what would feet like to do? Now that's very different than saying, and your feet are stuck. So when you get part of the body, then don't use the personal pronoun. Only use the personal pronoun I or he or she when you get the whole of the body there, such as I want to run away or I want to get out of there. Then you can say, and you want to get out of there. So those questions then go to the body, whereas questions to get metaphors go to the inside the body, to the feelings. And our third category is information that goes outside of the body. So he's coming to get me. So when it's he's coming to get me, then you know that's outside. And what the client is trying to say is, go outside my body. That's where the next information is. So when we consider these information storage forms, our task in asking questions is to ask a question at exactly the same locus that the client last responded from. So here are some examples. The client says, I'm feeling cold. And our first question is, and when you're feeling cold, where are you feeling cold? Because that goes inside. I'm cold. There's an I pronoun, and that probably could go inside, but probably goes outside to the body. And so then we can respond, and when you're cold, what happens next? It's cold. Then we know that that's outside. And we can respond, and when it's cold, what happens next when it's cold? Do you understand how those questions go wherever the client last answered? So there's one other rule that we need in order to be able to manage these three different information forms. And that's this, that the last thing that a client says is usually the most important. So if they say, I want to run away, but I'm too scared, then you know I want to run away comes from their body, but I'm too scared is inside. So it's their feelings that stop them from running away. And so then you ask, and when you're too scared, where are you too scared? You go to metaphor. I want to run away, but I can't move. The first part, I want to run away, goes to the body. The second part, I can't move, goes also to the body. So then we can use the pronoun you. And when you can't move, what can you do when you can't move? So the client in this case is saying, do something to my body, help my body. It's my body that can't move. Whereas in the first case, it's the feelings inside that stop the body from moving. And in the third case, I want to run away, but he won't let me. I want to run away as the body, he won't let me, is memory, external environment, or the ground that's outside. So what stops her from running away in this case is he that's outside. So the client is trying to say, heal up my memory, my outside. Do something about him. Then I can run away. So we need to value whatever quality of information the client is going to give us. And what this means is that we can shift. So if I'm working with metaphor and I can't get anywhere with it, I know I could ask a question to the body or to the ground, environment, or memory. And if I ask to the child, and what do you want to do, and the child says, I don't know, then I can go right into metaphor by asking, and when you don't know, how do you know you don't know? I get confused. And when you get confused, where do you get confused? And thus we can get the metaphor for why they don't know, and that should help to help free the child from this particular predicament.
He lets me go.
And he lets you go. And as he lets you go, after an awful long time, what happens next? After an awful long time, and he lets you go. And you can move. And when you can move, what do you do next when you can move?
I go home.
And you go home. And can you go home when you can move?
I'm afraid.
And you're afraid to go home. And when you're afraid, where are you afraid when you're afraid?
In my throat, in my head.
And in your throat and in your head. And when you're afraid in your throat and in your head. And whereabouts in your throat?
Where I try to swallow.
And when you try to swallow, and does it have a shape or a size when it's in your throat?
It's yucky. It's thick.
And it's thick like what?
Honey. It's thick like honey.
And it's thick like honey. And it's thick like honey. Metaphors and symptoms are found in combination with the body of who owns them and the external memory or environment. And it's this combination that creates an enmeshment. So we have the body or owner, and then the metaphor is found inside the body, and then outside here in the ground or the environment is the context of what's occurring, whether it's a perpetrator or somebody out here. Now what happens that enables metaphors and symptoms to freeze this moment of time in T-1 is that the child, or even an adult in a traumatic event, loses all sense of ego boundary. So there becomes no differentiation between what their body is and between the ground, and between what their feelings are. So it's very easy for a child, for instance, to feel responsible when parents get divorced. And this is why it's so critically important to individuate the body from the feelings, from the ground or memory. It's this enmeshment, this fusion of these three things together that creates, similar to Murray Bowen's idea of an undifferentiated family ego mass. In this case, this is an undifferentiated information mass. which is why when clients usually first present their symptoms, there's usually a chaotic mishmash between what their feelings are inside, what their body is doing, and then what's going on outside here. And it's this breakdown of any kind of sense of ego boundary that creates the enmeshment which binds the symptoms in the moment of time t-1. So in order to be able to mature this information, we need to individuate these three elements so that we separate the ground, can be separated away from the body of the child, and the feelings can be taken out and put out here in the ground where they belong. So that's our purpose in maturing the information and to create a healing solution, is we need to keep the body separate. Things that were metaphors inside need to go out to the ground, and then this body needs to be growing out of the ground also. So our purpose, separate, individuate, three different information forms, mature them up so things get worse, and then find out in T+1 how they can be incorporated into a different dynamic and a different milieu. So the ground is the ground, the child is the child, and these foreign objects or metaphors are out in the ground where they belong.
Right.
And her stomach gets tight. And as her stomach gets tight, it gets tight like what?
Like someone wringing out a dish rag.
And it gets tight like someone wringing out a dish rag. And is there anything else about that tight like someone wringing out a dish rag?
They just keep getting tighter and tighter and pulling it.
And they keep getting tighter and tighter and pulling it. And as they keep getting tighter and tighter and pulling it, what happens next?
The little girl stops dead in her tracks.
And she stops dead in her tracks. Metaphors and the symptoms from which they're derived are unsuccessful attempts at healing. My job as a therapist is to provide a suitable context in which these metaphors can be successful. And it's in this manner that we can endeavor to find ways in which the client can use their own healing resources to heal themselves. That's very different than coming from the therapist's point of view and saying, I am going to heal you. So the beauty of metaphors is they provide a very rich and royal source of information that allows you to delve deeply and find a client's own healing ability. And we do this in a rather simple way. First of all, we know that the metaphors are going to be found somewhere on the inside of the body. And two ways we can help them to be healing. First of all, if there's no ground or content for a metaphor, then what we may have is a spinning in a head, which is like a whirlpool. And that's when a client gets confused. And then we may find that they have this awful feeling in the bottom of their stomach, and it's like a rock. Now there's no ground, so we can combine metaphors together, which is to ask them if they would be interested in coming together. And so what happens is the whirlpool comes down to this rock which is covered in slime, and it cleans off the slime. And then this rock becomes a clean rock. And often inside a clean rock, then it can roll away outside of the body. And this green slime then gets incorporated into the whirlpool, and the whirlpool begins to slow down. And so that's a way in which you can recover a memory from a mind that's spinning. A second example, which illustrates how a metaphor can be primitive and unsuccessful, and yet when given an appropriate context, it can become healing, would be something like this. A client is scared as we're trying to recover a memory. And in being scared, we find the metaphor is a knot in the stomach. And then we ask, and what happens next when you have a knot in the stomach? And all of a sudden the client starts going blank or blocking. And when you go blank or block, what kind of blank or block could that be? It's like a big block, like a big concrete block. So now we have a metaphor that's inside the head of a block, and we have a knot that's in stomach. And what happens next? He's going to get me and I can't get away. So where is that? Well, we know that's outside, isn't it? So here we have a perpetrator now who is coming to get the child in this case. And this is what the enmeshment is all about. You see, we have the perpetrator outside in memory, we have the body of the child who wants to get away, and then we have metaphors that are inside. Now, this metaphor of a block in the head and this knot in the stomach is dysfunctional. So how can we provide a context in which it can be successful? Well, you'll notice that things go from bad to worse. So as we develop information about the block, it's not just an ordinary block as it's like a block. It becomes a big, huge block. And it's no accident that as we develop these, all of a sudden the client says, he's coming to get me. He's the problem, not my feelings. So then we introduce the block. And could a block that's in head be interested in going to him when he's going to get you? And what could a block do when a block goes to him? Well, a block could go out and block him. So that's what a block can do. A block can go outside of the head and blocks him. Now see there, that block is successful. It blocks him. And it belongs outside in the environment. And this is the wonderful thing about healing with metaphors, is that you take the onus and responsibility of that child to have to do anything to that perpetrator. It's just a little kid. So these metaphors can go out and fight the good fight. We can commission this block out so it wrestles with the perpetrator. And what happens next when a block blocks him? His hands are coming to get me. And as his hands come to get you, could a knot in stomach be interested in going to his hands? And what could a knot in stomach do to his hands? They could tie his hands up and then they wouldn't hurt me. Now there's a successful knot. So what in fact we've achieved is now we no longer have to have the knot in the stomach, and we no longer have to have the block in the head. But they can go out and wrestle with the perpetrator. And this is the art of being able to individuate feelings from the body, from the ground, because then we have the body of the child which we can help exit from out of this memory. And what happens next? I want to get away. And can you get away? I think so. So then we can empower the body of the child to exit that memory, and we leave the knot and the block wrestling with the perpetrator, and that frees the child up. So this is why the metaphors to begin with are primitive and unsuccessful attempts at healing. It's the only way a child could deal with the situation. And we can make that a successful healing adventure by first of all making the block bigger as we grow towards from T-1 towards T, and then asking if the block would be interested in doing that. And that way, it's a successful metaphor. And then the block can transform externally, and we can free the child from the experience. So this is very much the origin of many symptoms which our clients bring to us, is that they're unsuccessful attempts. And the question is, how can we encourage those to be successful?
I don't know how long.
And a shadow's fist hits, and could a drum that was in top of stomach be interested in going to a shadow's fist that hits?
Yeah.
And what happens when a drum goes to a shadow's fist that hits?
The fist bounces off of the drum.
And the fist bounces off of the drum. We're going to break down the procedures into a number of different phases. The first phase is separation. And what we're attempting to do here is to separate the adult information from the metaphor's information. So we know that any use of the pronoun I or you is going to go to the whole of the adult. And what we want to do is to locate very specifically where the information source is, if it's in the head, or if it's in the stomach, or if it's in the foot. So we locate this information, and the separation involves keeping the I-ness or you-ness of the adult away from the it-ness. So it's quite important to value the it and to listen to the impersonal pronoun, whether the client introduces it or whether you introduce it as the therapist. What would you like to have happen?
I would like for the pain to go away.
And when you have the pain, where do you have the pain?
I have the pain in my ankle and in my foot, on the inner side of my foot.
And on the inner side of your foot. The next phase, individuation, is different from separation in that separation separates adult information from information that's within. Now this within information is enmeshed and fused together. And in the individuation phase, what we're going to do is ask questions which extend the significance of the words or phrases downwards. And it's extending the significance downwards that we begin to give value to each of these three separate pieces of information. So these are the three information storage mechanisms that lie in the moment of time T-1, enmesh together and freeze that moment of time. So we begin with the actual body. And the body, whether it be a child within or an earlier phase of adulthood, has to be separated from a feeling, which may be inside, and outside of the body then is the memory content. And so whatever is memory content needs to be differentiated from the body and from the child within. So in order to do that, we ask questions that extend the significance downwards. So they have a deepening effect. We're not moving the questions along, but we're gathering information about each of these sources. So with memory, then we come out here and ask questions that have to do with memory content. Now we know this because the client uses phrases like he's coming to get me, or it's dark, or it's cold. Those phrases tell us the information source is outside, therefore our next question must also be locused outside of the body of the child within. Those questions would be, and when he's coming to get you, what's he like? As he comes to get you, what happens next? See, what's important here as we do not enmesh the information together. So when the client responds that the information is outside, if we were to say, and what are you feeling when he comes to get you, we're connecting the perpetrator and enmeshing them with the feelings of the child within. And that's the kind of question that causes an iatrogenic influence. You see, a child has a great deal of difficulty in ego boundaries and in separating what a perpetrator does. You know that a child during a divorce will generally feel responsible for the divorce of the parents. And we do not want to enmesh and connect the responsibility of a child in this particular situation with what the perpetrator does. So that's why this individuation is important. It helps differentiate memory content from body or feelings of a child. When we get a body information, then we must deepen the significance of the body information. And we know that because we'll get an I pronoun, like I can't move, I want to run away, or a body part. So those questions, then we can use the pronoun you. So the pronoun you can then be used because it addresses all of this part of the body. Now, when we get a body part, such as my feet are stuck, then we drop off the pronoun and feet are stuck. So we empower body parts rather than connecting a body part, feet, to the rest of the body, which at this moment is not present. And then our third information source is any kind of feeling or thought that may be in the head. We individuate that out and we put those feelings into metaphor. And then, of course, what we find is that this metaphor in the body is, in fact, a foreign object that needs to be placed out. And very often, it's that foreign object that provides the healing momentum to enable this child to escape or to resolve this particular traumatic memory. So the individuation phase involves asking questions that develop the information. In the metaphor, it's where is it? What's it like? What kind, shape or size, color, anything else, etc. Those questions develop the information of a metaphor downwards. Questions that go to the body ask for the age, what the child could be wearing. Those help develop the body. And questions that go to memory develop the outside memory content and what happens next when it's dark. When it's on the inner side of your foot, what's it like when it's on the inner side of your foot?
It's like pressure.
And pressure. And when it's like pressure, what kind of pressure?
It's like a balloon. It's like a balloon that's filled to capacity.
And a balloon that's filled to capacity. And is there anything else about a balloon that's filled to capacity?
It feels like it's going to burst.
And it feels like it's going to burst. The next phase, maturation, involves taking the 3 different information forms and moving those towards T. So we know that we gather this information in a moment of time, T minus 1. And we have these 3 different information forms, and our purpose is to grow them towards the moment in time, T, until we can get into T plus 1 when it's all over. And so what happens is we have to ask questions that will move along a metaphor, such as a knot, that will move along the body of a child within, or that will move along memory content. And there's an interplay between developing the information and maturing the information. Our most important questions for maturing are, and what happens next? So and what happens next a metaphor, or and what happens next a child within, or and what happens next memory content that's outside. So we expect that things are going to go from bad to worse. We also expect that as we move a metaphor, then all of a sudden we're talking about a knot in the stomach, and what happens next when a knot in the stomach gets tighter, then we hear, I'm scared. I want to run away. So there's an I pronoun, and we know that I want to run away goes to the body, so we're switching between the metaphor inside and the I pronoun to the body. And what happens when you want to run away? He's coming to get me. So that goes outside. The next question, then we have to develop more information about him. So we're going to get a series of stepwise maneuvers like so, that we switch from one information form to the other until we get to the moment of time t, when we look for solutions. So the maturation phase involves moving and developing as the information sources switch between each other. And when a balloon feels like it's going to burst, is there anything else about a balloon that feels like it's going to burst?
No.
And when a balloon feels like it's going to burst, what would a balloon that feels like it's going to burst like to have happen?
It would like to have all of the air let out of it.
And it would like to have all of the air let out of it. In the solution phase, there are three primary ways that we can shift information from the moment of time t-1 through t into t+1. The first is a type 1 kind of solution, and what that involves is simply maturing the information. And as we ask, and what would rock or not or what have you like to have happen, and what would like to do, and what happens next? This is a very linear solution, and what we're doing is in fact moving the information along, and it's going to go from bad to worse. Once we get to T, these are the kinds of experiences in which you take the client through T. There's no other way but going through the experience. And what happens next, it goes inexorably on like a Greek tragedy. And so you move through T in a very linear way until you get into t+1 and it's all over. So the essential element we're doing here is making time move. And in making time move, we're growing the whole experience up, both the memory, the feelings, everything grows up.
By the elbow.
And by the elbow. And which elbow could a dark needle like to tear? Flesh first.
On the left.
On the left elbow. And can a dark needle begin to tear flesh on the left elbow?
Yes.
And as a dark needle tears flesh on the left elbow, what happens next as a dark needle tears flesh on a left elbow?
It likes it.
And it likes it. And as a dark needle tears flesh on a left elbow and likes it, what does a dark needle want to do next?
It wants to stop.
And it wants to stop. And when a dark needle stops and it likes to tear flesh on a left elbow, what would a dark needle like to do next?
It would like to be broken.
It would like to be broken. There is another type of solutions we'll call type 2 solutions. And the difference between a type 2 solution and a type 1 is with a type 1 we go right through the experience. Now with the type 2 we do something else that's different. We begin by again growing the information towards T. But as we get right at the moment in time T, the symptoms get worse. And in the first type of a type 2, we don't have any memory content. So we have the body of the person, but there's no outside information. And in this particular example, what we find is that we have a bent needle that's in the arm. And we also have a balloon that's in the foot. And we're going to invite this bent needle here to go to the balloon. That is, these are both disparate metaphors that are in the body, and we bring those together and see how they can transform each other.
Like a bent needle.
Like a bent needle. And what kind of bent needle could that bent needle be?
Like a sewing needle.
And like a sewing needle. And the bent needle like a sewing needle. And where could a sewing needle like to go? And what would a sewing needle like to do when it's bent?
It would like to heal the hurts.
And it would like to heal the hurts. And which hurt?
In the ankle.
In the ankle. And can a sewing needle be interested in going to an ankle that
Yes.
hurts?
Yes.
And what would a sewing needle do to an ankle that hurts?
It could pop the balloon inside the ankle.
And whereabouts on a balloon would a sewing needle like to pop?
Right in the middle of it.
And right in the middle. And can a sewing needle pop a balloon right in the middle?
Yes.
In the recombination phase, we want to take all the metaphors that we found in T-1 and the transformations that have occurred in T+1, and we want to recombine them together again so that they can transform each other, that they can become part of each other and be different. And so in the following example, you'll notice that the balloon, which contained all the sludge, can now go to the tapestry and become involved in the tapestry. So the recombination, in fact, helps to transform the metaphors, again, usually outside of the body.
A multicolored
A multicolored,
tapestry.
a multicolored tapestry. And could a balloon that had been in a foot be interested in going to a multicolored tapestry?
Yes.
And what would a multicolored tapestry do to a balloon?
It would invite it in.
And as it invites it in, what happens to a balloon that's invited in?
It is incorporated into the tapestry.
And incorporated like what?
Like silk.
The last phase, the proclamation phase. And this is where you take the metaphors that have wounded and they have been transformed then into things which can now be healing. So the tapestry comes around, wraps around the foot of the client and becomes an orthopedic stocking. And then the foot that had the pain and was wounded can then begin to dance. And see, this is a foot, in this case, that belonged to a 19-year-old. And this foot has not danced like this since the scarring. So we empower the foot to dance, and the foot can proclaim its healing. And when a foot loves that, and what would a foot like to do when a foot loves that?
It would like to dance.
And a foot would like to dance. And if a foot would like to dance, and a foot had been wrapped with an orthopedic stocking that was beautiful, would a foot be interested in tap dancing?
Okay. Sure.
And a foot could tap dance with a tapestry like that. And would a foot like to dance any other kind of dance?
Ballet.
And ballet. And could a foot ballet?
Yes.
I hope that you have enjoyed this presentation and that the framework and concepts which have been presented will both give you new material and will also, in fact, support some of your own intuitive ways of working. You'll probably find that working initially with metaphors is extremely hard work and frustrating work operationally from the therapist's point of view, but it ought to be smooth and easy from the client's point of view, because you endeavor to only ask questions that are answerable not only by the client, but are answerable by the metaphors at the age in which those metaphors were born. It's an exciting adventure working with metaphors, and the next tapes will provide you with a presence of interviewing the client yourself. So see if you can second guess where my next questions are going to be. And I think that's the best way of reinforcing some of the patterning and words that are useful in working with your own clients. And that these following interventions will give you a simulated environment in which your own skills can be encouraged and developed. We have just begun, I think, to discover some of the wonderful wisdoms that are inherent in metaphors, and wisdom for healing that a client has carried around for many, many years. So it's a very exciting era to be in, and I hope that your clients find these particular methods healing and useful. And so in the words of Obi-Wan Kenobi, metaphors be with you.